For the first time in nearly a decade, Doctor Who's future wasn't at immediate risk of cancellation. Following on from the 30th anniversary, the show had proved itself as a worthy component of 90s British television that could still captivate general viewers. With more eyes on the show, the production team strolled into 1994, determined to prove their worth with season 31. Season 31 of Doctor Who would have starred Richard Griffiths as the 8th Doctor, along with Lisa Bauman as Bernice Summerfield and Robert Bathurst as new companion Chris Hector. It would also see Ian Fraser acting as producer with Colin Brake as script editor. Season 31 would see yet another slight refresh to the show's format, with the arrival of both a new companion and a new script editor. This would be the first season for Colin Brake as script editor, after Ben Aronovich decided he wanted to move on to other projects. Brake wanted to try and move away from the darker tones of seasons 28 to 30, and try to make the show a more worthy opponent to the wave of imported American sci-fi shows such as Star Trek The Next Generation. This would be Ian Fraser's final year as producer on Doctor Who. Fraser wished to move on from Doctor Who and took the first opportunity he could to step down from the role, fearing that he could end up stuck in the role for years like his predecessor if he didn't leave when he could. With the departure of Higgs in the last season, and with the 8th Doctor needing a second companion to take the lead where Griffiths couldn't, Brake was tasked with introducing a new companion. He devised the character of Chris Hector, a unit sergeant, with actor Robert Bathurst cast in the role. In an attempt to differentiate Chris from Higgs, Chris was written to be more approachable and less gruffer than Higgs. Season 31 would air between the 9th of July 1994 and the 19th of November 1994. It would consist of 20 episodes across 6 stories, with 4 3-parters and 2 4-parters, and would go out weekly on Saturday night. This story sees the Doctor and Bernice being summoned to Earth by Winfred Bambera, who is after the Doctor's help in a current investigation. UNIT is investigating a private military boarding school after picking up traces of alien energy surrounding the camp, as well as reports of students acting strange as of late, and claims from a nearest wreck of a student named Jonathan, who claims to have seen creatures from another world. The story would see the Doctor and Bernice working with UNIT to track down the source of the alien energy, as well as the creatures Jonathan claims to have seen. We would see the Doctor and Bernice also working alongside one of Bambera's best men, Sergeant Chris Hector. Chris has great respect for the Doctor, having read his files, and ends up getting on extremely well with Bernice. After some investigating, the Doctor tracks the source of this energy to a strange organic-y orange plant. He also discovers several more of these plants, all exhaling a strange orange smog. The Doctor cuts one of these plants out of the ground and takes it to the building's science facility in order to identify its planet of origin, and to the Doctor's concern, he discovers that the energy originated from Zygon, the planet of the Zygons. The Doctor and Chris then head back to the TARDIS as the Doctor needs to retrieve a device that'll locate the Zygon ship. At which point, Bernice and Jonathan, who remain behind in the lab, are ambushed and attacked by a group of students who were actually Zygons in disguise. Jonathan is ultimately killed and disintegrated, whilst Bernice is knocked unconscious and carried away by a Zygon, while another Zygon disguises herself as Bernice. When the Doctor and Chris eventually return, the Zygon Bernice, who, for the sake of clarity, I will refer to as Benny Z, claims to the Doctor that her and Jonathan were attacked and that Jonathan has been abducted by the Zygons. The Doctor then uses his machine to track down the Zygon ship, which he discovers is buried deep within the earth, directly under the school. The group enter via the basement, where they find a hidden stone passageway behind a moving bookshelf. As we see the group gradually making their way through a giant cave system, we see Bernice awakening from her coma and finding herself in a receptacle. She proceeds to break free from her imprisonment and finds herself inside the Zygon spaceship. She proceeds to knock out a Zygon before locating a control room. There she finds a live camera on the Doctor and Chris and discovers they're walking directly into a Zygon trap. She then uses an intercom to warn the Doctor and Chris about the ambush. The Doctor and Chris attempt to escape before they're surrounded by a group of Zygons. Benny Z then restrains Chris, however the Doctor is able to break free and escape captivity by using the tracking machine to create a high-pitched screeching noise which startles the Zygons. However, Chris is unable to escape and is taken prisoner by the Zygons. They then imprison Chris as well as recapture Bernice. Back on the surface, the Doctor finds himself now working directly alongside Bambera, as the Doctor uses a mix of unit technology and the Zygon plant to make contact with the Zygon ship. The Zygon leader reveals their plan to take over the Earth to the Doctor. They explain that the Zygon plant, known as Zecta, is capable of reproducing on a mass scale, and that the energy is actually a Zygon chemical which changes any planet's environment into one that would be suitable for the Zygons. The Zygons plan to mass produce the Zecta across the Earth and turn the planet into a Zygon too. The Doctor gives the Zygons the usual ultimatum: stand down or he will have to stop them. The Zygon leader laughs and cuts communication. He proceeds to activate some controls, and we see the Zectas suddenly spew out tons of energy, which both create more Zectas and turns both the air and ground orange. With time running out, the Doctor works alongside Bambera, as well as Unit's current scientific advisor, Dr. Jenny Newman, to come up with a way to stop the Zygon Invasion, as well as finding a way back into the Zygon spaceship, after the Zygons put both the spaceship and the school on lockdown. Using more technology from across the school, the Doctor and Jenny are able to create a transmitter device which will disable all nearby Zygon technology. The device is activated and the Zygon ship loses all power, resulting in the lockdown being lifted and the Zygon prisoners, as well as Bernice and Chris, being released. We then see Bernice and Chris helping the rest of the prisoners escape from captivity, whilst the Doctor, Bambera and Jenny head down to the Zygon ship, with Bambera leading a group of soldiers down with them. The Doctor reunites with Bernice and Chris, whilst Bambera and her men hold the Zygons as prisoners. With the day still not saved and the Zector still spreading, the Doctor quickly reboots the Zygon systems and prepares to release a second chemical into the air, which will kill all the Zecta. However, before the Doctor can press the release button, he realises that this gas will also kill the Zygons, as it's designed to kill all forms of Zygon life. The Doctor's hesitant to press the button. However, Bambera forces the Doctor's hand down on it, which releases the gas and kills both the Zector and the Zygons. This also then initiates a countdown until the ship blows up. Everyone quickly evacuates the ship and makes their way back to the surface as the spaceship blows up. The story then ends with the Doctor and Bernice returning to the TARDIS, with Chris saying goodbye to the duo. Bernice then suggests to the Doctor that maybe Chris could come with them. The Doctor agrees and asks Chris if he'd be interested in coming with him. Chris responds with, "You know what? Sure," before following Bernice into the TARDIS. Bambera shouts at Chris for abandoning his position and orders the Doctor to bring him back at once. The Doctor stares at Bambera coldly as she continues to shout. He then closes the TARDIS door behind him before the TARDIS dematerializes right in front of her. We then end with Bambera grunting to herself before whispering under her breath, "I swear that man." This story sees the Doctor, Bernice and Chris helping the Galactic Federation track down the Diadem, a crystal tiara inhabited by an evil intelligence which has plunged the planet Paca into centuries of war. The Doctor's previously encountered the Diadem during his third incarnation, where he believed he initially destroyed the Diadem. The story would have been set primarily on Peladon, 50 years on from the events of the Monster of Peladon, where we see the Doctor and Chris meet with Alpha Centauri, as well as an Ice Warrior delegation led by Ice Lord Savar and his adjutant Saket, who the Doctor has a hard time trusting. We also see the Doctor meeting with Lady Liana, the handmaiden to Queen Farley on Peladon, as well as Federation representative Nick Reese, which surprises him as he's never met Reese before. Soon after the Doctor's arrival, however, the curator of the Crown Jewels is murdered and the Lance of Agador is stolen. The Doctor pushes his way into the investigation and is naturally suspicious of the Ice Warriors. However, before the Doctor can determine who the killer is, Liana is also murdered, impaled on the Lance of Agador itself. The Doctor is found holding the lance in her body, and although he claims he was trying to remove it, he's placed under arrest and, in the confusion, the crown of Sherak also disappears. Atissa, the High Priestess of Agador, calls for the Doctor's execution, and it appears that Tarol, the King of Peladon, has no choice but to sentence the Doctor to death. Chris and Alpha Centauri attempt to appeal the verdict, but he refuses to change his decision. The Doctor privately admits to Chris that Leona died in his arms, naming her killer as she did so, but he's not ready to divulge the killer's identity yet, as he is hoping to use the killer as bait to draw the ancient diadem out into the open. Meanwhile, we see Bernice on the planet Paca, as she attempts to locate an archaeological team who were also in search of the diadem. The team eventually finds it, however the diadem possesses the professor of the group, who proceeds to kill the rest of them. Then a group of mercenaries show up, who kill the professor and take the diadem back into their ship and place it in a vacuum case. Bernice then pursues them in a shuttle and fires an EMP at them, which knocks out the safety seals on the case and allows the diadem to exert its influence on a mercenary named Sadler. It's eventually uncovered that the killer on Peladon is actually Nick Reese. However, it turns out that Nick Reese is actually an imposter who is also leading a group of mercenaries. It's discovered that the real Nick Reese was lured away from Peladon and murdered and replaced by an imposter who plans to obtain the diadem and its powers, as well as take over Peladon and plunge the Federation into eternal war. The mercenaries eventually pick up an Ice Warrior transmission, signalling the Federation that their delegation has been killed, and come in to land on Peladon, believing that it is now safe for them to do so, but Sadler has all but succumbed to the influence of the diadem. In the end, Nick is killed by Tarol using a sacred Peladonian sword named the Sword of Truth. Meanwhile, Sadler, who's been fully possessed by a diadem, attempts to flee from Peladon after sensing the return of the Doctor. However, the ship is shot down by an Ice Warrior. The story then ends with the Doctor rescuing Bernice and making peace with the Ice Warriors for his initial untrust in them, before they return to the Galactic Federation. All seems well, but the Doctor fears that the diadem has not been completely destroyed. And he's right. It's out on the surface of Peladon, lying amongst the remains of Sadler's shuttle, recuperating and waiting to be found yet again. This story sees Bernice pondering about her father, Isaac Summerfield. Bernice and everyone in her family believe that Isaac was thought to be a traitor in the Dalek War. Now wishing to learn the truth about her father, she asks the Doctor to take her back to see for herself. The Doctor agrees, but insists upon accompanying her in case she is tempted to save her father's life. The Doctor tracks Isaac down to a small village named Little Cadwell in 1983, where he and Bernice find him running what initially appears to be a coffee bar and bookshop. Isaac explains that he and his crew have been stuck in the 20th century for 2 decades, after their ship was shot through a space-time rift. They then used their future technology to set up an underground railroad named the Pyramid to evacuate aliens stranded on Earth. The story would see the Doctor, Bernice and Chris, and Isaac up against 2 threats. The first would be a woman named Ellen Woodworth, who works for a secret British government department responsible for dealing with extraterrestrials named C-19, who take and extract aliens that the Pyramid don't get to and attempt to use their powers for themselves. Realising he can't reason with her due to her being obsessed with alien invasion, the Doctor lets Isaac take her back to Little Cadwell to be dealt with. She manages to escape but is eventually killed. The second threat would be a Navarino named Albinex. Unlike the rest of his race, Albinex has a mean streak and wishes to revive his planet's warrior status. Albinex attempts to invade Earth by summoning a Navarino ship through the rift. However, he is stopped by the Doctor with the help of Isaac and the Pyramid. The story then ends with the Doctor contacting C-19 and Unit, who spin a cover story about the launch and agree to work with Isaac from now on. Isaac also asks Bernice to stay behind with her and help run the Pyramid. However, Bernice declines the offer, as she still has more travelling to do, but promises to pop by and visit whenever she can. The Doctor, Bernice and Chris then enter the TARDIS before it dematerialises. This story sees the TARDIS arriving in a place named Empire City on the planet Orvelo during Tragedy Day, an annual holiday celebrated in Empire City, where the rich donate part of their wealth to the poor. The Doctor also reveals that he visited Olorel many years ago, when the natives believed themselves to be cursed by a fragment of red glass, which was brought to their world by a dying stranger. However, he dismissed these fears as superstition, and proved that their sickness and crop failures plaguing their community were caused by radiation leak from the stranger's damaged spacecraft. He used chemicals from the TARDIS to decontaminate the area, and took the red glass from the villagers. As the Doctor, Bernice and Chris begin to explore, they become aware of the cult of Luminous, an evil cult which colonized the planet sometime after the Doctor's first visit, and killed most of the population. The Empire itself collapsed soon afterwards, and the human colonists remaining on the planet picked up on the native superstitions and the stories of the Doctor's previous visit. However, the trio soon discovered that Luminous is actually still in control of the planet, with their base of operations being a giant submarine named the Gargantuan. They also discovered that the cult is now being led by a boy genius named Crispin, who acts as the Supreme One. We also learn that the cult are controlling the planet by controlling the media, such as the planet's TV shows. The story sees the Doctor and his companions working with some newfound allies on Orelel to try and stop Crispin and wipe out Luminous for good. In the end, Crispin is killed when his sub is destroyed, and the power of Luminous is shortly then after broken. This story would have been set in Antarctica in the year 2006. The story's narrative would have mostly followed around Ruby Duvall, a reporter for the Sunday Seeker, who's travelling on a ship named the SS Elysium on its voyage around the Earth for a story. The Elysium eventually arrives in Antarctica, where the ship is then taken over by a group of Cybermen who have been hiding in the South Pole for 20 years after the failed International Electromagnetic Invasion. The story sees the Cybermen attempting to sabotage the Flipback Project, a project created at the Antarctic Snowcap Tracking Station, which will deal with the imminent reversal of the Earth's magnetic poles. The Cybermen plan to sabotage the Flipback Project and take over the Earth in the ensuing chaos, whilst also attempting to convert the people on board the Elysium. In the end, the Cybermen are defeated by Ruby, along with the Doctor, Bernice and Chris, when Ruby permanently disables Flipback, which causes the Earth's polarity to be reversed before the Cybermen are ready to deal with the change, and causes them to go out of control before blowing up the now dead Cyberman base underneath the ice. The story then ends with the Doctor thanking Ruby for her help, as well as offering her the chance to travel in the TARDIS with him. Ruby politely declines the offer before the Doctor, Bernice and Chris head back to the TARDIS. This story sees the Doctor, Bernice and Chris on a trip to Manchester when they're suddenly attacked by a baby vampire. The vampire begins to attack Bernice as it attempts to suck her blood, which slowly begins to turn her into a vampire. Then, later that night, with Bernice being unable to return to the TARDIS, they're attacked by another vampire named Eric. The Doctor traps Eric and attempts to learn what exactly is going on, when Eric suddenly begins to be telepathically killed. Realising that there must be a great vampire conspiracy at work, the Doctor sets out to investigate. It turns out that a Time Lord named Ruaf, one of the Doctor's old friends, is attempting to resurrect a great vampire known as Yarvin by using the Doctor's blood. The Doctor finds that Ruaf has become a vampire herself and is attempting to build a machine that freezes time in eternal night to allow the vampires to feed forever. With Bernice now fully converted into a vampire, the Doctor allows her to convert himself into a vampire. Then and only then is he able to destroy the machine and stop Yarvin. And, with the help of Chris, he's able to revert himself, Bernice and Ruaf back to normal. The story then ends with Ruaf powerless and her plans foiled. The Doctor then takes on board the TARDIS and takes her back to Gallifrey to stand trial for her crimes. Season 31 was a fairly popular season. Whilst it wasn't as successful as Season 30, which was almost to be expected, it was more successful than Seasons 28 and 29. Many people liked the new duo of Bernice and Chris, which audience felt was different enough to rein in Higgs. Although the decrease in the darker aspects of the show was felt by audiences, most seemed to like where the show now appeared to be heading. As 1995 came to a head, fans and viewers of the show received big news concerning the future of the show. Not only was Frasier's successor named, but it was revealed that the show was now going to be produced by an independent company, one who had ambitious plans for the show's formula. And yet, that wasn't the only big news that dropped in advance, as audiences learned that the next season would be the final run for the 8th Doctor.